We are on Photography Show, Andrew Boy, and in this episode we're going to learn to use your camera's spot meter like a professional photographer.
Action!
Now before we start our shoot and learn to use the spot meter, it's best that I teach you how to read your exposure meter. This is called your exposure meter. As you can see, you have positive on one side and negative on the other end, 0 in the center. Now, if you were to have this bar swinging to the positive end, that shows that wherever that you're pointing your camera to is bright. On the other hand, if you have it swinging to the negative side like so, whatever that you're pointing your camera to is pointing to somewhere that's darker. So as you can see, there are scales to indicate how bright or how dark they are. So this is showing that you're going towards more and more and more bright. Now, let's talk about midtone. This is midtone. But midtone is just not one line or one dot. It's a range because this is also midtone, slightly darker midtone. We call it 1/3 of a stop darker than midtone. And this is 2/3 of a stop darker than midtone. So this is still midtone. On the other hand, this is also called midtone. It's 1/3 of a stop brighter than midtone. And this is 2/3 of a stop midtone. They are all still midtone. So as long as your main subject falls in this region, you are fine. You got your subject in midtone. Now, anything that is brighter than here is going to be called highlight. So highlight begins here. So if I were to point my camera and it register here, this is highlight. This is even brighter highlight, and this is full-blown highlight. And if you keep on going, you are heading towards overexposure. Now, let's move to shadow. Anything after this midtone here, this is where shadow begins. So this is still shadow, this is even darker shadow, and this is dark shadow. If you keep on moving, it's going to be very intensely dark shadow. So some people can consider this underexposure. Now you can point your camera to somewhere even darker and you notice that there's an arrow or your exposure meter will blink depending on the camera that you have. So now that you know where midtone ends and shadow begins, and where shadow ends and underexposure begins, you can now learn to use your spot meter effectively. You would have learned in the previous episodes of how to use your meter on average metering mode. Now Canon will call it evaluative metering, Sony will call it multi-segment, Nikon would call it matrix metering, but I prefer to call it average metering because what it does is when you take up your camera and look through the viewfinder and point your camera to your subject, what the camera essentially does is that it will average out all the lighting in all the layers from the foreground to the subject layer and the background layer and reports to you in the exposure meter. But that's not really good because many times you have your subject in a high contrast lighting area. What do I mean by that? I think it's time to introduce you the model of this episode. Viewers, say hi to Demi. Demi is going to be modeling for us, and that is exactly the reason why I chose this location to post Demi here, is because of the strong sunlight that's coming through this window here, while the other part of the room here is quite dark. I would say you would need an ISO of 1600 to shoot, and that's an ISO of 200. That's what we mean by contrasting light. Now, we're going to take shots that look like this. So you're right, we're going to switch our camera to black and white mode just to prove a point how good spot meter is when it comes to lighting like this. So after you have set your camera to black and white, this is the second thing you need to do. Turn it to spot metering mode. Of course, some of you would have a different knob. Go ahead and do that now. You're now looking through my viewfinder. As you can see, my focus point is actually where I used a spot meter to measure my light. And it's exactly here that it will be measuring light. So I have my spot meter measuring Demi's chin right now. Now the exposure meter tells me that with the ISO 1600 at f4 at a shutter speed of 640 on full manual mode, I'm registering a shadow on the chin. This is not what I want. I want the chin to be a mid-tone, but a very bright mid-tone. So what I do, I reduce my shutter speed. As you can see, this is the end of mid-tone. That's somewhere about here. Now, that's where I want the chin to be. So you can actually use your spot meter to confirm every part of your subject's face where you want the brightness to be. Now, let's find out if shadow is really shadow. Now, where's the shadow? We can find shadow here on her left hand. So put the spot meter there, you can see that great, we've got shadow, a full-blown shadow. So a shadow here and a bright mid-tone here. So now let's move this around to confirm. Let's look at Demi's left cheek. This should be mid-tone too. It's a beautiful mid-tone. There you go. What about a right hand? As you can see, that's a bright mid-tone. Excellent. So now we can use this setting to take a shot of Demi in full black and white. So you can see the gray tone. Now let's look at another scenario. My ISO is the same 1600, my aperture is f4, but my shutter speed now is very low. Which is why if I were to take my spot meter and point it to Demi's chin right now, the camera is yelling to me, "You are too bright, you're overexposed. Can you see the triangle there?" Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to decide how bright or how dark I want this chin to be. You tell me. Well, maybe for this shot, I want this to be mid-tone. Exact mid-tone. So this is what I do. I move this shutter speed higher and get this to exactly mid-tone. Right on the dot. Try not to move because it fluctuates if you were to move. Now, let's use the spot meter to measure the hand. We should get shadow. Very dark, intense shadow. Let's confirm. As you can see, it's very dark shadow. Very good. Now, just to prove a point, if I were to move to Demi's cheek right now, I should see a highlight forming. That's good. And that is how you use your spot meter and the technique that you learned earlier that's called highlight and shadow metering. You don't need to go hunt where mid-tone is. Just find out where highlight falls and find out where shadow will fall, and mid-tone will take care of itself. So if you like what you learned, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. And in this episode, we're going to learn how to use your spot meter like a professional camera.
A professional camera.
Canon calls it. I'm going to switch my camera to black and white mode so that you can see what we're going to try. What are we talking? What do I want to see?